3rd century Rome experienced chaos with pressure coming from barbarians to the north and Persians to the east. Turmoil created unrest within the empire after 225. Political instability brought a civil war which almost brought down the empire. For 35 years, between 235 and 270, a series of emperors arose, mostly from the army, and these men were killed in battle or assassinated. As if the internal chaos wasn't bad enough, the empire also endured a brutal outbreak of the plague. Aurelian came to the imperial throne in 270 and ruled Rome successfully for 5 years. Aurelian restored the empire, which had fractured into 3 separate regions, drove Rome's enemies back, and recaptured most of the lost territories. After his death, the empire once again fell into chaos until the accession of Diocletian in 284. Christianity's growth led the Roman people to ask, why have all these woes afflicted us? Why have we had to face such plagues and civil war and distress? Rome found the answer in the displeasure of the gods, and of course that displeasure was due to the rise of Christian influence. Roman historians argued Christianity destroyed the old faith, which gave Rome its character and moral fiber. Christians were ostracized and viewed with suspicion once again. As a result, Christians could not hold public office, serve in the military, or marry. During the early 3rd century, though, Christianity came out of the shadows a bit. Lenient policies toward believers permitted them to form public organizations such as burial societies, which was simply an organization to help people pay for funeral expenses. Doing so, however, allowed them to enjoy a period of near tranquility. Churches built church buildings as early as 244. The first known structure is at Dura Europos, located on the Euphrates River in eastern Roman Syria. From outside, the building looked like a typical Roman home. Inside, though, 2 rooms were combined to form a meeting hall, and another was reconstructed into a baptistry. Decius became emperor in 249, and he was convinced that all of Rome's problems stemmed from the gods' displeasure. Determined to unite the empire in the worship of one religion, he issued an edict ordering all citizens to worship the old state gods on penalty of death. Those who bowed to the state gods or offered a pinch of incense to Caesar and acknowledged him as Lord received a libellus. A libellus was simply a certificate of compliance. Decian persecution lasted only 2 years, but the emperors who followed continued the pressure on the church. Christians responded just as you might expect. There were those who stood firm and faced death or torture with faith and courage. Some caved in and received their libellus. Now they may have offered a pinch of incense to the image of Caesar and acknowledged him as Lord, or they may have purchased a libellus on the black market, or they may have forged a libellus. But there were still others who went into hiding. Well, who were the true Christians? Those who fled? Those who faced death and somehow survived? Those who survived without denying Christ somehow received honor and became known as confessors. Recognition of certain heroes of the faith as confessors was the first step toward the veneration of the saints. Those who held the libellus, those who had gotten a libellus in one way or another, became known as the lapsi, the lapsed. In the years following, the church struggled with what to do with those who had purchased or obtained a libellus. Should they be received back into fellowship, or should they face consequences? Well, I'll deal with that in a little while. With the coming of Diocletian to the imperial throne, an effort to stabilize the empire began. Diocletian, an outstanding military leader, spent his first few years restoring order on the frontier. Realizing the difficulty of one man ruling the entire empire, Diocletian devised a plan to divide power between trusted military leaders whom he believed would keep specific geographic regions under control and yet remained fully accountable to him. So Diocletian first divided the empire in half, with the dividing line located roughly east of the Balkans. Diocletian ruled in the eastern half of the empire, and ruled with the title Augustus. He appointed Maximianus, a trusted general, as the Augustus in the west. The title Caesar was given to Constantius Chlorus, who ruled with and subordinate to Maximianus. Galerius took the same position under Diocletian in the east. To solidify the rule even further, Galerius was married to Diocletian's daughter, and Diocletian insisted Constantius Chlorus put away his wife Helena and marry Maximianus' stepdaughter. Chlorus resented this order because he loved his wife Helena, who was a Christian and the mother of his son Constantine. But I think you can begin to see the genius of the plan. There are 3 generals, all under Diocletian's thumb. He was the most equal of all 3, and he need not worry about them rising up against him because they were related. They had familial ties. Diocletian intended for the Caesars to move up upon retirement or death of the Augusti. New Caesars would then be appointed, assuring a smooth transition. Diocletian, who was in ill health, retired in AD 305. He prevailed upon Maximianus to step down as well. Romans expected Constantine and Galerius' son Maxentius to step in as Caesars. Galerius, who followed in Diocletian's footsteps and became the Augustus in the east, passed over his son in favor of a nephew, Maximianus II, and he demanded Constantius Chlorus pass over Constantine and appoint Severus. But before all of these events could occur, while in Britain fighting Picts in 306, Constantius Chlorus became ill and died. Upon his death, the army immediately proclaimed Constantine the new Augustus in the west. And the result is civil war. In a series of battles and political intrigue, Constantine became the sole ruler in the Western Empire. The battle at the Milvian Bridge is perhaps the best known of all of his battles. In this famous battle, Constantine's forces faced those of Maxentius, who had carved out a power center in Italy. Somewhere near Rome, Constantine saw his famous Chi-Rho vision, along with the words, "Under this sign, conquer." Constantine ordered his troops to paint the symbol of the Chi-Rho on their shields and made it into their laborium, or regimental banner. As Constantine's army neared Rome, his opponent took shelter in the city. The city was well fortified, well provisioned, and the army could hunker down there for quite some time. No one really knows why, but Maxentius and his army ventured outside the walls of Rome and met Constantine's forces at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine's victory at the Milvian Bridge assured his rule in the empire's western half. The date of his victory? October 28, 312. Constantine's consolidation of power throughout the whole empire is every bit as dramatic. His conversion following his vision did not change his approach to political power, although it did soften actions taken toward Christians. After conferring with the leader of the Eastern Empire, a man named Licinius, the two issued the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan, issued in 313, was a statement of toleration for all religions, particularly Christians. Within a year, however, toleration for Christians became an issue due to a lack of trust between the two leaders. The Eastern ruler harassed Christians, suspecting they were kind of a third column, undermining his authority. Differences increased until Constantine finally moved against the Eastern ruler and easily defeated his army. At that point, Constantine became the ruler of the entire Roman Empire. Although some doubt the authenticity of Constantine's conversion, there is no doubt he did much to benefit the church. A 19th century historian by the name of Jacob Burckhardt suggested that the only reason Constantine converted was to bolster his position among Christians whom he hoped would support him in his conquests. Burckhardt cited Constantine's delayed baptism as an evidence. Constantine waited until almost time for his death before he permitted his baptism. But this really doesn't compute. Christians in those days believed baptism washed away all previous sins. Thus, delaying baptism assured forgiveness of all sins. This practice, known as clinical baptism, was widely popular in the 4th century. Constantine, however, gave evidence of his preferral for Christianity in a number of different ways. He gave them preferential treatment, to be sure. For example, he exempted clergy from military and municipal service. He removed church property from tax rolls. He abolished pagan customs and practices offensive to Christians. He promoted freeing slaves and simplified the procedure to do so. He set aside the first day of the week as a legal holiday of rest. Northern cultures knew the day as Sunday. Latin cultures refer to the day as the Lord's Day. In French, it's dimanche, which means Lord's Day. In Spanish, it's domingo, which means Lord's Day. He did not change the Christian day of worship from Saturday to Sunday as groups like the Seventh-day Baptists or the Seventh-day Adventists teach. He merely recognized the day as a day of rest, since Christians already met on that specific day. He contributed heavily to church construction. He offered 20 pieces of gold and a white robe to anyone who professed Christianity. He abolished death by crucifixion. Now, he didn't do anything about the gladiatorial combats at that point. He did so after he moved the capital to Constantinople, however. He outlawed the Jewish practice of stoning other Jews who had professed Jesus as Messiah. And he promoted the copying and distribution of Scripture. Christianity rapidly spread throughout the Roman Empire. When the 4th century began, historians estimate Christians numbered about 10% of the Roman population. At the end of the century, Christianity had grown to nearly 90% of the population. Now, there were a number of factors that contributed to the growth of the church. Let me mention them. Of course, there was Constantine's endorsement, although many who became Christians during that period did so nominally without really exhibiting a genuine faith. Second, the distribution or disintegration, rather, of Roman society was beginning to occur, and as society crumbled, the church offered support and assistance to those in need. The church's inclusiveness promoted growth. There were no social or racial or economic barriers within the church. Everyone could come. Anyone could profess Christ and become a part of the church. Church organization contributed to the growth of the church. The church leadership was superior, its organization sublime, and provided better shepherding, supervision, and discipline. The church also grew because it was unyielding and yet flexible. These two contradictory terms are both true. The church refused to budge when faced with persecution or false teaching, but where salvation was not threatened, the church adapted. The church grew too because of Christianity's superior religious and philosophical base. It grew because of its Jewish origin. Judaism was old, and Jews were people of the book. And with its ancient background, the Gentiles accepted the Bible as classical literature and were familiar with it. It grew because of miracles. It grew because of the moral qualities. In spite of their earlier suspicions, Romans ultimately saw Christianity as a moral faith with qualities missing in paganism. And of course, Christianity grew because there was no leader like Jesus. His uniqueness was outstanding and stood out in the minds of the people. Let's talk for a few minutes about monks and monasteries. The dramatic changes Constantine brought about were not easy for some Christians to accept. Christians responded in different ways. Some were grateful for the new attitudes expressed by the leaders of Rome, and they found it difficult to take a critical stance as a result. Most Christians held to this perspective. Eusebius of Caesarea is an example. Here's a man who lived through the persecutions, and the government's new policies toward Christians seemed almost miraculous to him. In his church history, he gives the impression he believed God intended for the church and empire to come together, and he saw Constantine as the new David. But there were other Christians who retreated into the desert to take up the monastic life. The origins of monasticism date well before the time of Constantine, but the new conditions led many to follow the monastic ideal. There were several factors that contributed to monasticism. First, there were those who chose to withdraw from practices they considered unspiritual. There were many nominal Christians who became part of the church during the 3rd and 4th centuries, and spiritual Christians saw these nominal believers as a threat to church purity, and they preferred to withdraw. Second, Greek thinking contributed to the idea that flesh was evil, and thus they withdrew to the desert or to the places where they could be alone to subdue the body and avoid worldly pleasure. Third, Christians seriously considered the words of Jesus, "Love not the world, nor the things that are in the world." You escape attachment to the world by withdrawing. Monasticism in its early stages offered opportunities to buffet the body and develop personal spirituality. Anthony of Egypt is usually identified as the first monk. He took seriously the words of Jesus to the rich young ruler to go sell everything he has and come and follow him. And so Anthony sold all of his possessions and retreated into the Egyptian desert. Anthony represents monasticism's first stage, which is called Eremitic or Anchorite monasticism. He is actually a hermit monk, living alone outside the settlements. He worked with his hands, ate little, and gave much away. In spite of hardships, he lived to the ripe old age of 105. Anthony's reputation as a spiritual giant gained him a following. Christians sought him out for spiritual guidance and counsel. Around 305, Anthony organized a few of these disciples into a community of hermits. Known as a lora, this community is simply a street with huts on one side and huts on the other. Each hermit monk lived alone together. They had nothing to do with each other. They simply lived in the same area. They became known as monachos, those who live alone, or monks. As you can easily see, the word monk comes from that term, monachos. Pachomius represents a second stage. Pachomius came from a pagan background and became a Christian while serving in the Roman army. He knew it was difficult for everyone to live life as a hermit, although he started out as such. In AD 320, he set up the first true monastery where men lived together, emphasizing a common life or experience. He sets up a simple military structure with the leader, the abbot, sitting at the top of a chain of command. His arrangement becomes known as koinos bios, or common life, or it's sometimes called cenobitic monasticism. Communal life requires organization and rules. So Pachomius divided his community into 24 groups or classes and set up primitive rules to govern their life. The Latin word for rule is regula. So in time, monks are called the regular clergy. Those who serve in public functions in the church, such as the bishops or the priests or the presbyters or the deacons, become known as the secular clergy because they're out in the world. So the regular clergy were the monks who lived by a specific system of rules and way of life. The secular clergy were those who fulfilled the general church functions. By the 4th century, extremes began to set in. One monk, for example, lived in a cistern, eating only 5 figs a day. Other monks trained themselves to sleep standing up in the middle of a room. One Egyptian monk rejected finery and made perfume of stagnant water. In an effort to deal with some of these excesses, Basil of Caesarea established a monastery in Cappadocia. This monastery became the foundation for all Eastern monasticism. He reworked Pachomius's rules and established what became known as the Rule of Basil. His rule had 4 purposes. First, he intended to suppress the hermit monks, leading them to a more complete form of monasticism. Second, he moved monasteries from the desert into the cities or near to the cities where monks could be involved in some sort of Christian service. Third, he restricted austerity and self-inflicted suffering. Fourth, he set a schedule in order to reduce daily prayer times. Fifth, he encouraged study to upgrade the intellectual growth of the monks. But there were still those who who lived by themselves and intended to do things in their own way. Simeon Stylites is without a doubt the wackiest of all of those. He represents a few who remains out on the lunatic fringe. Simeon became a hermit monk at age 23. Thinking that he would grow spiritually, he chained himself to a huge rock in a cave for 40 days. To protect his leg from the chain, he covered it with a piece of leather. When he removed the leather after 40 days, he found 20 fat bugs feeding on him. Another spiritual exercise found him encouraging his friends to bury him up to his neck each day in the ground at night. At age 33, he decided to take up residence on a pillar. He built a pillar with a platform 6 feet off the ground. And then he lived on that pillar for the rest of his life. He occasionally raised the pillar, which eventually reached a height of 60 feet. Living on the pillar, of course, meant that he couldn't bathe. Food had to be brought up to him. There were no means that he could avail himself to have any kind of hygiene or waste elimination. And so you can imagine what it was like for him living on that platform. According to accounts, Simeon's faithful, who honored him and loved him and cherished him, also cherished each worm that fell from his vermin-infected body. As you can see then, some retreated in an effort to encourage true spirituality. Others simply broke from the church, insisting they were the true Christians. Still others formed communities and tried to initiate forms that we would simply understand today as true monasticism. All right, let's come back to that question that we asked earlier. What do you do about backsliders? What do you do about those who accommodate themselves to Rome? I had mentioned how some had fallen or backslidden Christians and then wanted to return to the church when persecution ended. The question arose as to what to do with these lapsed Christians. Should those who caved in to Rome or accommodated with Rome's demands be accepted back into the church, or should they be refused admittance? The church offered 3 possible solutions. First, offer instruction and then make it easy for them to come back into the church. Second, deny these backsliders readmittance and let them know that salvation is possible only through martyrdom. Or thirdly, accept them back into fellowship, providing they do 2 to 3 years of penance, after which they can be readmitted as new believers who need to go through the catechetical school, who need to go through all of the processes and preparations that were required for baptism and for becoming Christians. The controversies which followed were immense. In North Africa, near Carthage, a schism occurred led by Donatus Magnus. Donatus took issue with those who suggested the traditors or the lapsed or the lapsi should be allowed back into the church. There were also those during that period who had surrendered Scripture during persecution, and Donatus thought that that was even worse. So he insisted these backsliders should be rebaptized and reordained before they could be readmitted. If any of them were church leaders, or perhaps even bishops, who had submitted to Rome's demands to offer incense to Caesar or to the Roman gods, then Donatus said that even those whom they had baptized should not even be recognized as legitimate Christians. And so anyone coming back into a church where the Donatists were in charge had to be rebaptized. More radical than the Donatists were the Circumcellians. Particularly strong in remote areas, the Circumcellians became militant and did not hesitate to defend themselves with arms. Although Roman officials tried to suppress both groups, both Donatists and their militant brethren continued in small groups until Islam spread throughout the region. Paganism continued despite decreasing numbers. Constantine's 3 sons succeeded him, but it was a time of turbulence in both church and politics. When the last of Constantine's sons died, he was succeeded by Julian, called the Apostate. Julian did his best to restore the veneration of the gods. He reorganized pagan rites, following the model of the church. He had recognized the effectiveness of the church and the organization that they followed and the rituals that they followed. So he thought if he could simply reorganize pagan rites according to the model of the church, paganism would come back into favor. And as a result, he withdrew many of the privileges previously granted to the church. While he did not overtly or openly persecute Christians, he made it plenty uncomfortable for them. At the same time, the Roman majority simply ignored his efforts. The Roman people were not interested in going back to the old pagan gods. From Constantine to the end of the 4th century, the church produced some excellent leaders and scholars. Athanasius of Alexandria opposed a man called Arius. Arius was a presbyter in the Alexandrian church. Arius adopted a theological position much like contemporary Jehovah's Witnesses. Jesus, said Arius, was born at a time separate from the Father and is therefore subordinate to the Father. Arius described his teaching in a letter to Eusebius, the bishop of Nicomedia. He said, now if you can make any sense of this, you write and tell me, okay? Because here's what he said. The Son is not unbegotten, nor part of the unbegotten in any way, nor is he derived from any substance, but that by his own will and counsel he existed before times and ages, fully God, only begotten, unchangeable, and before he was begotten or created or appointed or established, he did not exist, for he was not unbegotten. We are persecuted, he said, because we say that the Son has a beginning, but God is without beginning. For that reason we are persecuted, and because we say that he is from what is not, and this we say because he is neither part of God nor derived from any substance. Well, I think you can see where that would cause some conflict. And conflict between Orthodox Athanasius and Arius set off a firestorm. Constantine tried to mediate, but it did not end the controversy. Previous arguments over the nature of Christ, such as adoptionism and Gnosticism, took a back seat to the fuss over Arianism. Constantine called a council to convene in Nicaea to settle the issue. Following the Jerusalem Council in Acts, monarchical bishops in a variety of regions met on occasion to discuss issues and promote solutions, but none of them were anything like the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea can be called the first ecumenical council. Over 300 bishops, mostly from the Eastern Empire, came together to discuss the issues. Those bishops supporting Athanasius were most vocal and were well represented. As the bishops in council debated, the differences boiled down to 2 terms, homoousios and homoiousios. Was Jesus identical with the Father, or was he like the Father? The council produced a creed which represented a compromise then banished Arius and 2 bishops who refused to sign on. This creed, written in 325, AD 325, was later amended and is now known as the Nicene Creed. Controversy continued after the council disbanded. Constantine recalled Arius at one time and ordered Athanasius to restore him as presbyter. Athanasius refused, and the emperor deposed him, banishing him. And until the deaths of the 2 men, Athanasius would be in favor with Constantine, then Arius, and then Athanasius would be back in favor, and then Arius, and it just simply went back and forth. Arianism did find wide acceptance in the barbarian lands until 496, and that's kind of important. Other controversies raged over the nature of Christ for several centuries. Was Christ fully human, or was he fully divine? It was suggested, for example, that God is one God, but he makes himself known in 3 different persons. He is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Others argue Jesus and the Christ must be kept separate. Christ's deity and his humanity never mix, much as oil and water never mix. Both may be present in one receptacle, but they never mix. Still others maintain that just as wine mixes with water and the 2 are indistinguishable, so the deity and humanity of Jesus are mixed and indistinguishable. Nestorius, Apollinarius, and Eutychus try to explain the Godhead, but all end in judgments as heresy. Impossibly difficult names were applied to their views: Monophysitism or Monothelitism. They're even hard to pronounce. I have posted a table of these controversies and their resolutions on the course site. Into this controversy came the great Cappadocians, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. These scholars came from Cappadocia, located in the middle of what is now Turkey. Their work clarified the doctrine of the Trinity. Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. He is 100% God and 100% man. It's not very good math, but it makes good theology. His human nature and divine nature cannot be separated. Now, you'll find some information about this on the course site, and I would encourage you to look onto that. I may even post another lecture from a guest lecturer who goes into some of this material much more deeply. Let's look at 3 other individuals who were very important during this period. Ambrose was a government official who was unexpectedly elected Bishop of Milan. His selection occurred when the Bishop of Milan died. Church leaders proposed that Ambrose, a man known for his integrity and political acumen, become the next bishop. Reluctantly, Ambrose accepted. In a single day, he became a Christian, went through the church offices leading to qualification as a bishop, then was ordained. In the region around Milan, there was a great deal of Arian influence, and that led to clashes with the Empress Justina, who was also a defender of Arian theology. In every conflict with imperial power, however, Ambrose came out on top. Where Ambrose was a well-respected politician and church leader, Jerome was a biblical scholar. Jerome was a passionate Christian who founded an ascetic brotherhood. He spent time in a monastery where he was ordained a priest, and he became convinced that the monks were the only real Christians. And so he often attacked the secular clergy for their worldly living, growing prosperity, and their pride. To get away from things like that, he retreated to a desert private cell where he spent 34 years in study. His major contribution to Christianity is a translation of the Bible from Greek to Latin. Roman Catholicism still considers Jerome's Vulgate, his Latin version of the Bible, their standard version. Other translations, including the Venerable King James Version, owes much to Jerome and his Vulgate. Augustine of Hippo is without a doubt the most important of the theologians of this period. Augustine has an interesting history. He was born in what is now Algeria to a divided home. Monica, his mother, was a devout Christian, while his father did not become a Christian until much later. His mother insisted that he become a Christian, but Augustine preferred Manichaeism, a doctrine similar to Gnosticism. Education and worldly behavior took up most of young Augustine's time. He took a concubine who bore him a son, a Deodatus, whom he loved deeply. When he completed his education, he taught rhetoric in Carthage, then went to Rome in search of more lucrative employment. Finding teaching opportunities rare in Rome, he then went to Milan hoping to find paying students. In Milan, Augustine came under the influence of Ambrose. One day, while in a garden, Augustine heard the words, "Take up and read, take up and read." He found a Bible on a nearby bench, opened it to Romans 13:13 and 14, and read these words, "Because we belong to the day, we must live decent lives for all to see. Don't participate in the darkness of wild parties and drunkenness, or in sexual promiscuity and immoral living, or in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, clothe yourself with the presence of the Lord, and don't let yourself think about ways to indulge your evil desires." Hearing that, he went to see Ambrose, who talked to him about becoming a Christian. Ambrose then baptized him and his son Deodatus on Easter Sunday in the year 387. Following his conversion and the death of his son, Augustine returned to Africa. He intended to stop over in the small community of Hippo located outside of Carthage. The church's bishop there persuaded him to remain as his assistant. And having done so, Augustine became a presbyter in 391 and then assistant bishop in 395. The next year, the bishop died, and Augustine was named to the post. As a bishop, Augustine opposed Manichaeism. He opposed Donatism strongly, and he opposed Pelagianism. Pelagianism emphasized human initiative in salvation. Donatism found a worthy opponent in Augustine and Donatism faded under his assault. His theology undergirds most of Western thinking. He fleshed out the doctrine of original sin and predestination along with ethical concepts of the just war. Perhaps no greater theologian ever existed. The church today, whether Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, still feel the impact of his writing. Well, our survey of this period ends with barbarian invasions and the fall of Rome in 410. Rome considered anyone, not a Roman, to be a barbarian. When used more specifically, the term identifies Germanic peoples who crossed the Rhine-Danube frontier to settle in the Roman Empire. Although invasions from the east may have driven Goths and Vandals, some of the Germanic peoples, into the empire, many came in search of a better life. It became impossible for Rome to defend the borders, and these invaders from the north came to take unproductive lands the Romans had abandoned. Barbarians joined the Roman army, which led to problems when sent on missions against barbarians coming into the empire, or when there were skirmishes along the border. Alaric led a barbarian army into the empire in 407, surrounded Rome, and intended to sack the city. At that time, the Roman bishop was in town, and he negotiated a settlement, and Alaric took his army south only to return later. When he returned, the Roman bishop was not in town, and Rome could not buy him off, so Alaric ordered the sack of Rome. Barbarian soldiers raped and pillaged the city throughout the city streets of the great city, but those people who took shelter in churches escaped unscathed. Alaric's soldiers were Arian Christians who respected church property. Rome's fall left the empire in shambles. Augustine penned The City of God, in which he stated God's true city lay outside this world. Jerome wept, convinced the fall of Rome meant the immediate return of Christ. Rome's fall after more than 700 years without attack left the empire convinced it was the end of an age. They were right. Rome's fall marked the end of the Western Roman Empire. The empire existed in the east, called the Byzantine Empire, for another 1,000 years. But there was no longer an emperor in the west, although technically, I suppose, the Byzantine emperor still remained in charge. But the dream of a concerted and united Western Empire never really entirely disappeared. And in future lectures, we'll see attempts to restore the Roman Empire and see how the European church and state collaborated, much like they did in the days of Constantine and his successors.